Good morning, Year 1 and 2. So we are moving on to our next chapter book and we are reading Roald Dahl, The Magic Finger. And it's illustrated by another great person, Quentin Blake. And he wrote Mr. Magnolia, if you remember that from our phonics. So we are up to page 14. Let's read on and find out what happens next. Here's the picture. I'll show you that first before I start reading. Make sure your listening ears are on. Late that night, after Philip and William had gone to bed, Mr. Gregg went outside to get some wood for the fire. He was crossing the yard when all at once he heard the call of a wild duck in the sky. He stopped and looked up. The night was very still. There was a thin yellow moon over the trees on the hill, and the sky was filled with stars. Then Mr. Gregg heard the noise of wings flying low over his head, and he saw 4 ducks, dark against the night sky, flying very close together. They were going round and round the house. Mr. Gregg forgot about the firewood and hurried back indoors. He was now quite afraid. He did not like what was going on, but he said nothing about it to Mrs. Gregg. All he said was, "Come on, let's go to bed. I feel tired." So they went to bed and to sleep. When morning came, Mr. Gregg was the first to wake. He opened his eyes. He was about to put a hand out for his watch to see the time. But his hand wouldn't come out. "That's funny," he said. "Where is my hand?" He lay still, wondering what was up. Maybe he'd hurt his hand in some way. He tried the other hand. That wouldn't come out either. He sat up, and then, for the first time, he saw what he looked like. He gave a yell and jumped out of bed. Mrs. Gregg woke up, and when she saw Mr. Gregg standing there on the floor, she gave a yell too. For he was now a tiny little man. He was maybe as tall as the seat of a chair, but no taller. And where his arms had been, he had a pair of duck wings instead. But, cried Mrs. Gregg, going purple in the face. "My dear man, what's happened to you?" "What's happened to both of us, you mean?" shouted Mr. Gregg. It was Mrs. Gregg's turn to jump out of bed. She ran to look at herself in the glass, but she was not tall enough to even see into it. She was even smaller than Mr. Gregg, and she too had got wings instead of arms. "Oh," sobbed Mrs. Gregg. "This is witch's work," cried Mr. Gregg, and both of them started running around the room and flapping their wings. A minute later, Philip and William burst in. The same thing had happened to them. They had wings and no arms, and they were really tiny. They were about as big as robins. "Mama, Mama, Mama," chirped Philip. "Look, Mama, we can fly." And they flew up into the air. "Come down at once," said Mrs. Gregg. "You're much too high." But before she could say another word, Philip and William had flown right out of the window. Mr. and Mrs. Gregg ran to the window and looked out. The 2 boys were now high up in the sky. Then Mrs. Gregg said to Mr. Gregg, Do you think we could do that, dear?" "I don't see why not," Mr. Gregg said. "Come on, let's try." Mr. Gregg began to flap his wings hard, and all at once, up he went. Then Mrs. Gregg did the same. "Help!" she cried as she started going up. "Save me!" "Come on," said Mr. Gregg. "Don't be afraid." So out the window they flew and far up into the sky. And it did not take them long to catch up with Philip and William. Soon the whole family was flying around and around together. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried William. "I've always wanted to know what it feels like to be a bird." Things are not getting tired, are they, dear? Mr. Gregg asked Mrs. Gregg. Not at all, Mrs. Gregg said. I could go on forever. Hey, look down there, said Philip. Somebody is walking in our garden. And you'll have to wait for the next bit to find out who it is that's walking in their garden. See you soon. Bye.